In its latest June operating study, the Bureau of Reclamation confirmed that Lake Powell is now moving toward a water year release of 6 million acre-feet, while projected inflow has fallen to just 3.4 million acre-feet, or 35% of average. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The planned release has been cut by 1.48 million acre-feet. Spring and early summer inflow has collapsed far below normal. Lake Powell remains close enough to critical power elevations that every foot of water matters. And downstream, Lake Mead is already operating under shortage conditions, with Hoover Dam producing less power as the reservoir falls. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is that Powell is releasing less water. The hidden number is the water Mead will not receive on the same schedule. This is not just a smaller release. This is a reservoir shock being transferred downstream. Holding more water behind Glen Canyon Dam may protect Powell from one immediate danger, but it also removes part of the flow that would normally support Mead, Hoover Dam, municipal intakes, farms, and water agencies across the lower Colorado River basin. The system is not eliminating scarcity, it is moving it. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell can be stabilized. The question is what happens when protecting one reservoir pushes the next operating test toward another. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this river map is showing how a decision upstream can become a warning downstream. At first light, the Colorado River system does not look like an emergency. There is no siren at Lake Powell, no wall of water is moving through a city, no single screen flashes red. The warning appears instead as a sequence of ordinary-looking entries inside a federal operations study. Reservoir elevation, forecast inflow, monthly release, storage volume, diversion, generator capacity. Each line seems technical. Together, they describe a river system being forced to protect one weak point by placing more pressure on another. In the latest June 2026, 24-month study, the Bureau of Reclamation placed Lake Powell under the mid-elevation release tier and confirmed that the annual release through Glen Canyon Dam had been reduced from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million acre-feet. That decision did not appear from nowhere. By the time it reached the public dashboard, the system had already been responding for months. Beginning in December, operators adjusted monthly releases from Glen Canyon Dam, holding back 598,000 acre-feet at Powell through April. The purpose was not to create a surplus. It was to slow the reservoir as it moved toward elevations where ordinary dam operations become less certain. Then the runoff forecast deteriorated again. The National Weather Service Colorado Basin River Forecast Center recorded May inflow into Lake Powell at only 18% of the 30-year average. The June forecast fell to 7%. The crucial April through July runoff period, the season that normally carries the mountain snowpack into the reservoir, was projected at just 15% of average. For the entire water year, the expected unregulated inflow was 3.4 million acre-feet, or 35% of average. On their own, these numbers could be filed under a dry year. Together, they describe something more operationally dangerous. The reservoir is scheduled to release substantially more water than the natural system is expected to deliver into it. That does not mean Powell instantly loses the simple difference, because upstream reservoir releases, local inflows, evaporation, bank storage, and other factors also enter the accounting. But it does mean that managers are working against a severe imbalance during the months when the river is normally rebuilding storage. The dashboard is not showing recovery. It is showing a system attempting to control the speed of decline. Look at how many agencies and operating units are already inside that response. The National Weather Service supplies the runoff forecast. The Bureau of Reclamation converts that forecast into reservoir projections and release schedules. The Department of the Interior authorizes the operating action. The upper basin states and reservoir operators coordinate additional water from Flaming Gorge. The Western Area Power Administration watches what changing water levels may mean for federal hydropower. Lower basin water agencies track the resulting path of Lake Mead. None of these institutions is responding to a separate crisis. they are watching different sections of the same moving load. The official plan calls for approximately 660,000 to 1 million acre-feet to be released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir toward Lake Powell by April 2027. On paper, that looks like water being added to the system. Operationally, it is water being moved from one federal reservoir to another to defend a target elevation. Flaming Gorge begins this action in relatively stronger condition than Powell, but the transfer is not free. Reclamation estimated that the upstream reservoir could fall by roughly 35 feet over the following year. This is the first sign that the system has entered a different mode. Water managers are no longer relying only on what the sky and snowpack deliver. They are rearranging stored water across the basin to keep critical infrastructure away from dangerous elevations. At Powell, the first target is 3,525 feet. That level is not the final failure point. It is a warning line used to begin protective action before the reservoir approaches more serious infrastructure risk near 3,490 feet. Reclamation has identified 3,500 feet as an operating elevation to preserve a narrow protective margin above that lower zone. A few dozen feet on a reservoir gauge may sound minor when the canyon walls rise hundreds of feet, but near a dam, elevation is not scenery. It determines pressure, turbine performance, available release routes, power generation, and the amount of operating flexibility left if the next forecast becomes worse. This is why the dashboard matters. The visible lake can still hold billions of gallons, while the usable operating margin becomes dangerously thin. The map shows a large reservoir. The system sees a shrinking vertical distance between normal operations and restricted choices. By late spring, that pressure had already changed the release pattern through Glen Canyon Dam. Lower releases affect more than the level of Powell. They alter the timing and volume of water moving into the Grand Canyon. Rafting conditions can change. Aquatic habitat responds to different flows and temperatures. Sandbars and sediment movement respond to altered releases. Hydropower production changes with both the volume passing through the turbines and the height of water pushing it. But the largest downstream signal is waiting hundreds of river miles away at Lake Mead. Mead begins calendar year 2026 under a formal shortage condition. Its operating rules already include reduced water availability and additional conservation measures across the lower basin. The June federal study projects major diversions continuing at the same time that inflow from Powell is being reduced. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California is projected to divert about 941,000 acre-feet during calendar year 2026. The Central Arizona project is projected near 924,000 acre-feet. Nevada consumptive use above Hoover Dam is projected near 188,000 acre-feet. These figures are not presented here to suggest that one city or one canal is causing the reservoir decline. They show the scale of the obligations that remain active while the principal upstream release is being cut. Mead is not an empty tank waiting passively for Powell. It is an operating reservoir, feeding aqueducts, farms, tribal communities, cities, wildlife programs, and power systems every day. Inflow is shrinking, while the network attached to the reservoir remains large. This is where separate dashboard lines begin to merge. A lower Powell release appears first as an operational decision in the upper basin. Farther downstream, it becomes a lower inflow assumption for Mead. As Mead falls, Hoover Dam loses hydraulic head. The pressure created by the height of water above its turbines. Reclamation, therefore, adjusts projected generator capacity as the reservoir elevation changes and performs unit capacity tests to determine what the plant can reliably produce. Federal officials have warned that the reduced releases from Powell could contribute to an additional reduction in Hoover Dam hydropower capacity as early as the fall. That does not mean the lights suddenly go out across the southwest. Hoover is part of a much larger electrical grid, but it means a flexible, low-cost source of electricity becomes less capable. At the same moment, drought is increasing demands elsewhere in the system. Power customers may rely more heavily on replacement electricity. Revenue connected to hydropower can weaken. Maintenance and environmental programs supported through power finances face additional strain. A water shortage begins to move through wires and budgets, and that is not the strangest part. The operating dashboard also contains uncertainty. The 24-month study is not a prediction carved into stone. It is a model built from current reservoir conditions, forecast hydrology, expected demands, formal operating rules, and assumed conservation. A most probable projection is one central pathway, not a guarantee. There are also minimum and maximum scenarios, and the river can move outside them. But uncertainty does not make the warning meaningless. It changes the type of warning. Managers are not being told exactly where each reservoir will stand on every future date. They are being told that the range of plausible outcomes now includes conditions close enough to infrastructure thresholds that waiting for certainty could remove the time needed to respond. That is why action began before the worst case arrived. Monthly releases were adjusted before spring runoff was fully known. Water was requested from Flaming Gorge before Powell crossed the critical infrastructure elevation. The annual release was reduced before Mead experienced the entire downstream effect. In an operating room, treatment often begins before every laboratory result is complete, because delay can narrow the remaining choices. The Colorado River is now being managed with the same logic, but every intervention has a pathway. Holding water at Powell improves Powell. Sending water from Flaming Gorge improves Powell. Reducing the release through Glen Canyon Dam improves Powell. The same action lowers Flaming Gorge, changes flows through the Grand Canyon, and reduces the water reaching Mead on the previous schedule. This is not a contradiction in the plan. It is the plan revealing the shape of the shortage. There is not enough water to protect every reservoir, every power plant, every recreation site, every ecosystem, and every delivery expectation without trade-offs. The system is no longer deciding whether scarcity exists. It is deciding where scarcity will appear first, how quickly it will arrive, and which operating margin can absorb it. By the time a household notices a new conservation rule, a higher power cost, a closed boat ramp, or a changed irrigation allocation, the load has already passed through months of forecasts, meetings, release schedules, and reservoir models. The event begins as snow that does not become runoff. It enters Powell as missing inflow. It reaches Glen Canyon Dam as a reduced release. It travels toward Mead as water that does not arrive on the old timetable. Then it moves into Hoover Dam, canals, budgets, farms, and cities. On their own, these signals can be treated separately. Together, they describe one larger configuration. A reservoir is being defended upstream. A second reservoir is being asked to absorb the consequence downstream. And the number that explains the scale of that transfer is the one we have not yet fully opened. 6 million acre-feet sounds immense. To understand why it can still produce a shock, we have to see what that number means outside the dashboard. 6 million acre-feet sounds like a number too large to represent shortage. It is enough water to cover 6 million acres of land 1 foot deep. Converted into a volume that is easier to picture, it is roughly 1.95 trillion gallons, or about 7.4 cubic kilometers of water. Released across an entire water year, it averages more than 5.3 billion gallons moving out of Lake Powell each day. Nothing about that sounds small. And that is exactly why the number can be misleading. The question is not whether 6 million acre-feet is a great deal of water. The question is whether it is enough water for the position the Colorado River system is now in. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Powell was originally projected to release 7.48 million acre-feet during water year 2026. The revised operating action reduces that amount to 6 million. The difference is 1.48 million acre-feet. That is approximately 482 billion gallons of water no longer scheduled to pass through Glen Canyon Dam on the previous timetable. It is almost 1/5 of the original release plan. In other words, federal operators did not trim a small amount from the edge. They removed a volume equal to nearly 1/4 of the water that will now be released. This is where the headline number changes shape. 6 million acre-feet is not simply a large delivery. It is a large delivery after a major cut from a reservoir receiving exceptionally weak inflow into a downstream system that was already operating under shortage. The number is not just water. It is the balance between two reservoirs being pulled out of position. To understand why, imagine the Colorado River as a sequence of accounts rather than a single bank. Snow and rain deposit water into the upper basin. Rivers move part of that deposit toward Lake Powell. Powell stores it, releases it through Glen Canyon Dam, and sends it toward Lake Mead. Mead then supports deliveries, power generation, evaporation losses, environmental flows, and releases farther downstream. When Powell sends less water, Mead does not immediately lose the entire reduction foot for foot because tributaries enter the river between the two reservoirs and other accounting factors affect the final balance. But the direction is unmistakable. A smaller release from Powell means less water is available to arrive at Mead than would have arrived under the higher release schedule. The change does not appear as a dramatic wave moving backward through the canyon. It appears as a line on Mead's elevation graph, bending lower over time. One day of reduced flow may be difficult to see. 1 month begins to matter. An entire water year can alter the operating position of the reservoir. That is how 1.48 million acre-feet becomes a shock. It is distributed through time. It arrives quietly. And by the time the difference becomes visible on the shoreline, the water has already been absent for months. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. It contains about 326,000 gallons. Water agencies use the unit because rivers, reservoirs, farms, and cities operate on scales far beyond a household gallon. But the unit also hides motion. An acre-foot sounds like a block that can be counted and stored. In reality, every acre-foot in this system has a destination, a season, an elevation, and an operating value. Water held at Powell in June is not equivalent to water arriving at Mead in June. The same physical volume can serve different purposes depending on where it is and when it is available. At Powell, it can raise the reservoir surface, preserve hydraulic pressure at Glen Canyon Dam, support power generation, and increase the distance above critical infrastructure elevations. At Mead, that same volume could support elevation at Hoover Dam, help maintain power output, increase the buffer above water intake thresholds, and reduce the speed at which shortage conditions deepen. The water cannot perform both jobs at once. That is the core constraint hidden inside the 6 million acre-foot figure. The system is choosing where the remaining water creates the greatest immediate protection. This is not necessarily a mistake. It may be the least damaging option available, but a least damaging option can still transfer risk. Consider the difference between the revised release and the earlier projection. 1.48 million acre-feet spread across the year averages more than 4,000 acre-feet per day. That is more than 1.3 billion gallons every day that will not move downstream according to the original schedule. The actual monthly pattern is not perfectly even, because Glen Canyon Dam releases change by season and operating need. Still, the average reveals the scale. Every 24 hours, the difference accumulates. After 1 week, it is measured in billions of gallons. After 1 month, it becomes large enough to affect reservoir projections. After a year, it is a missing layer in Mead's water balance. The visible number makes the headline. The accumulated difference writes the reservoir's next operating condition. There is another comparison that matters. For many years, 8.23 million acre-feet functioned as an important reference volume in Colorado River operations, though actual releases varied under different rules and reservoir conditions. A 6 million acre-foot release is 2.23 million acre-feet below that benchmark, a reduction of roughly 27%. That does not mean federal operators have casually abandoned a permanent annual promise of exactly 8.23 million acre-feet. The legal and operational framework is more complicated than that. Releases have always depended on storage conditions, basin rules, balancing provisions, and emergency actions. But the comparison shows how far current operations have moved from the volumes around which much of the system's recent history was organized. The river is being asked to function with a substantially smaller transfer between its 2 largest reservoirs. The canals remain. The cities remain. The farms remain. The power plants remain. The dams remain. What has changed is the amount of water available to hold all those pieces in their familiar positions. This is why the phrase 6 million can create the wrong first impression. Heard alone, it sounds abundant. Placed beside 3.4 million acre-feet of projected unregulated inflow, it describes a reservoir under pressure. Placed beside the earlier 7.48 million acre-foot release plan, it describes an emergency reduction. Placed beside Lake Mead's continuing obligations, it describes a downstream loss of support. And placed beside another potentially dry year, it describes a smaller recovery margin for the entire system. One number can therefore mean protection at Powell and stress at Mead at the same time. The contradiction disappears once location is added. Powell needs elevation. Mead needs inflow. The same acre-foot cannot defend both reservoirs simultaneously. Outside the dashboard, this will not appear as 6 million acre-feet moving through one recognizable moment. It will appear as changing water levels at boat ramps, altered power generation at two major dams, revised forecasts for urban water agencies, harder decisions for irrigation districts, and greater sensitivity to every new snowpack report. A strong storm in the upper basin will be measured against the missing volume. A warm spring will be judged by how much snow reaches the river instead of disappearing into dry soil and air. A conservation agreement in the lower basin will be evaluated by whether it can offset part of the reduced inflow. The number follows the system into every decision, and the system is not starting from full strength. Lake Mead entered this period far below its historic high watermark. Hoover Dam has already lost generating capacity as the hydraulic head behind the dam has declined. Water agencies have already built deeper intakes, banked water, paid for conservation, changed landscaping rules, and negotiated reductions. The 6 million acre-foot release does not create all of those pressures. It enters a network where those pressures are already active. That distinction matters. A smaller Powell release is not the single cause of Mead's condition. Decades of water use, prolonged drought, rising temperatures, evaporation, weak runoff, and operating decisions all shape the reservoir. But the reduction changes the next chapter. It removes part of the upstream support that Mead would have received under the earlier plan. The warning does not depend on pretending that one decision caused the entire crisis. The warning is that the decision had to be made at all. Operators are protecting Powell because the reservoir is approaching elevations that threaten ordinary power and release operations. Mead feels the result because the river connecting the two lakes carries not only water, but consequences. 6 million acre-feet is therefore not the measure of how much water the system has. It is the measure of how much water operators believe Powell can release while still defending Powell. That is a very different number. It is shaped by infrastructure thresholds, forecast uncertainty, upstream storage, and the fear that a worse inflow year could arrive before the reservoir has time to recover. The headline is 6 million acre-feet. The operational meaning is a reservoir being given less room to help the reservoir below it. And even that is not the deepest number in this story. Because the amount released tells us only the volume leaving Powell. It does not tell us how long the pressure lasts, how low Mead may fall, or how quickly the system loses options when the next dry forecast arrives. To find the number that writes the damage, we have to look not at the water moving through the dam, but at the margin disappearing behind it. The 6 million acre-foot release is the number everyone can see. It appears in the federal operating plan, in reservoir forecasts, and in every headline about Lake Powell. But that number still does not tell us where the damage begins. The hidden number is not simply how much water leaves Powell. It is how much operating margin disappears at Mead when that water does not arrive on the earlier schedule. Margin is the distance between the system as it exists today and the point where ordinary operations become harder, more expensive, or less reliable. It can be measured in feet of reservoir elevation, megawatts of lost generating capacity, months of storage, intake depth, or the number of dry seasons the system can absorb before another emergency action is required. This is the number that rarely fits into a headline because it is not one fixed value. It moves. It depends on weather, demand, conservation, evaporation, tributary inflow, and the timing of releases. But it is the number that determines how much room the system has left to make mistakes. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. At Lake Mead, water volume and water elevation are related, but not in a simple 1 foot for 1 acre-foot pattern. The reservoir is shaped by steep canyon walls, broad basins, narrow reaches, and changing surface area. When the lake is high, a large amount of water may be required to raise it by 1 foot because the water spreads across a wider area. When the lake is lower, the geometry changes. The same volume can produce a different elevation response. This matters because the infrastructure does not respond to gallons in the abstract. Hoover Dam responds to elevation. Intake structures respond to elevation. Hydropower turbines respond to hydraulic head. Boat ramps, pumping systems, and shoreline facilities respond to elevation. A missing volume becomes operational only when it changes where the water surface sits against those fixed structures. That is why a reservoir can still contain an enormous amount of water and still be close to a dangerous threshold. The system does not fail when the final gallon is gone. It begins losing functions long before that. Lake Mead can continue delivering water while generating less power. It can continue supporting cities while requiring deeper intakes. It can continue operating while managers lose flexibility. Each of these changes is a reduction in margin. And margin is what allows a system to survive uncertainty. Suppose the forecast is slightly wrong. Suppose the next winter produces less snow than expected. Suppose spring temperatures rise early and dry soils absorb more runoff. Suppose conservation savings arrive later than planned. A system with strong margin can absorb those errors. A system with weak margin must respond to each one. The danger is not only low water, it is low water repeated without enough time to rebuild. The hidden number is therefore not one missing delivery. It is the shrinking distance between today's elevation and tomorrow's restricted choice. This is where the Powell decision reaches Mead. Holding back 1.48 million acre-feet does not instantly lower Mead by a single dramatic amount. The effect is spread across the operating year and mixed with all the other water entering and leaving the reservoir. Tributaries between Powell and Mead still contribute flow. Conservation can reduce withdrawals. Weather can change evaporation. Demand can rise or fall. But the reduced Powell release removes a major source of expected support. It changes the baseline from which every other gain or loss is measured. A wet tributary season may now offset part of the reduction instead of building storage. A successful conservation program may slow decline instead of producing recovery. An average year may no longer feel average because it begins from a lower operating position. This is how a hidden number changes the meaning of every visible number around it. The same snowpack report, the same conservation volume, or the same summer demand can produce a different outcome when the reservoir has less margin. The first systems to feel this are not household faucets. They are the systems designed to prevent household faucets from failing. Water agencies begin revising scenarios. Power managers recalculate dependable generation. Engineers inspect pumps, tunnels, gates, and electrical equipment under conditions that may last longer than originally expected. Budget officers estimate the cost of replacement power and emergency construction. Agricultural districts reconsider delivery assumptions before planting decisions are finalized. The public may see no immediate change, but the planning environment has already shifted. A reservoir shock does not need to stop water deliveries to produce damage. It can force institutions to spend more money to preserve the same service. It can reduce the range of acceptable choices. It can turn routine maintenance into urgent maintenance. It can make a normal summer load feel like an extreme one because the system begins the season with less room. Consider Hoover Dam. The power plant depends on water pressure created by the height difference between the reservoir surface and the turbines. As Mead falls, that pressure declines. Less pressure means each unit of water can produce less electricity. The plant does not move directly from full operation to zero. It loses capability in stages. That stage decline is easy to underestimate because the dam remains standing and electricity continues to flow. But the hidden number is the capacity no longer available when the grid needs flexibility. Hydropower can respond quickly to changing demand. It can help balance other power sources. It can provide valuable electricity during high load periods. When Mead loses elevation, the grid does not lose only energy, it loses part of that flexibility. The missing water, therefore, becomes a missing option. The same pattern appears in municipal water infrastructure. Southern Nevada built a deep intake and a low lake-level pumping station to keep drawing water if Mead falls below the elevation of older intakes. Those investments greatly reduce the risk of an immediate supply cutoff, but they do not make reservoir decline harmless. Deeper pumping requires infrastructure, energy, maintenance, and money. The presence of a backup system is evidence of resilience, but it is also evidence that the original margin has already been consumed. The system continues working because new equipment has been built below the old operating line. Each adaptation can preserve service, yet it may also reveal how far conditions have moved from the assumptions under which the original network was designed. The weak point is not always the first structure to fail. Sometimes it is the final backup being asked to become normal. Agriculture feels the hidden number through timing. A farmer does not need to see an empty reservoir to face risk. Planting decisions depend on expected deliveries, market prices, soil conditions, credit, labor, and the length of the growing season. If water agencies become less certain about future allocations, that uncertainty enters the farm months before a shortage reaches the field. A producer may plant fewer acres, choose a lower value crop, lease water, or leave land fallow. The reservoir elevation becomes a financial decision. The financial decision becomes employment. Employment becomes household income. Household income becomes food, housing, and health. The event remains visible at the lake, but the damage begins inside a calendar. This is why the hidden variable is not merely volume, it is recovery time. How many good runoff seasons would be needed to restore meaningful margin at both Powell and Mead? How many weak seasons can the system tolerate before emergency measures become permanent? How quickly can conservation reduce demand, compared with how quickly evaporation and deliveries remove water? A reservoir can lose water faster than institutions can negotiate new rules, construct new infrastructure, or change agricultural economies. When that happens, the shortage moves faster than governance. The danger is not only that Mead receives less water this year, it is that the next decision may arrive before the effects of the current decision have been absorbed. One intervention protects Powell. Another may be required to protect Mead. A third may be needed to preserve power generation, deliveries, or environmental flows. Each action consumes money, water, political trust, or operational flexibility. The system becomes increasingly dependent on precise forecasts and timely cooperation. Yet the hydrology producing the crisis is becoming less predictable, not more. Warmer temperatures can reduce runoff even when snowfall appears near normal. Dry soils can intercept meltwater. Earlier melting can shift flows away from the periods when reservoirs and users need them most. A forecast based on snow alone can therefore overstate how much water will actually reach the river. The hidden number begins in the watershed before it appears in the reservoir. It is the fraction of snow that never becomes usable runoff. It is the water absorbed by dry ground, taken by vegetation, or returned to the atmosphere before reaching Powell. Then it becomes the inflow deficit at Powell. From there it becomes the reduced release. At Mead, it becomes lost elevation and lost margin. At Hoover Dam, it becomes lost generating capacity. At a water agency, it becomes a narrower planning range. At a farm, it becomes a decision made before planting. At a household, it may eventually become a higher bill, a conservation rule, or a job that no longer exists. The mechanism is already moving through the system before the public can see it. That is the central reversal in this story. The headline asks how much water Powell will release. The deeper question is how much time Mead loses when that release shrinks. Water can be measured in acre-feet. Time is harder to measure. Yet time may be the more valuable resource. Time allows snow to return. Time allows conservation agreements to work. Time allows engineers to modify infrastructure. Time allows farms and cities to adapt without sudden disruption. When reservoir margin declines, the system is not only losing water, it is losing time between one hard decision and the next. And that is the number that changes the risk first. The 6 million acre-foot release protects Powell from an immediate operating threat. But the hidden number is the smaller buffer left downstream, where every dry month now carries more weight than it did before. To understand how that buffer disappears, we have to follow the mechanism from the upper basin snowpack, through the soil, into the river, through Glen Canyon Dam, and finally, into the fixed machinery waiting at Mead. The mechanism begins far above Lake Powell, before a single gate moves at Glen Canyon Dam. It begins in the mountains of the upper Colorado River Basin, where winter storms store water as snow. That snowpack is often described as the river's natural reservoir. But snow on the ground is not the same thing as water in the reservoir. Between those 2 points lies the hidden machinery of the watershed. Temperature controls when the snow melts. Soil moisture controls how much of that meltwater reaches a stream. Vegetation takes part of it through roots. Wind and dry air return part of it to the atmosphere. Sunlight changes the speed of melting. The shape of the terrain determines whether water moves quickly into a channel or slowly into the ground. By the time runoff reaches Lake Powell, the watershed has already made thousands of small withdrawals. This is why a snow map can look acceptable, while the river below it remains weak. The mechanism is called runoff efficiency. In simple terms, it is the fraction of precipitation that becomes measurable flow in the river. In a cool and wet basin, more snowmelt can move across saturated soil and enter streams. In a warm and dry basin, the first water often disappears into the landscape. Dry soil behaves like a sponge that has been left in the sun. Before it can send water onward, it must absorb enough to replace what was lost during earlier heat and drought. Plants also use more water during longer and warmer growing seasons. The atmosphere can pull more moisture from exposed ground and vegetation. The snow may still melt, but a smaller share survives the journey into the river. The forecast shows snow. The reservoir receives only what escapes the watershed. That difference is not visible from a satellite image of white mountains. It appears later as missing inflow at Powell. Once the meltwater reaches the river, timing becomes as important as volume. A slow melt can extend flows and reduce sudden losses. A rapid melt can send water downstream quickly, but it can also expose the basin earlier to summer heat. If warm weather arrives before the soil is moist, runoff can peak early and then collapse. Reservoir operators do not only need water to arrive, they need it to arrive in a pattern the system can use. Lake Powell must receive enough inflow to rebuild storage after winter releases, and before summer demand and evaporation intensify. When spring runoff is weak, the reservoir enters the hottest part of the year without completing that recovery. The season has not merely delivered less water, it has removed the period when the system normally repairs itself. This is not just drought, this is recovery failure moving downstream. At Lake Powell, the mechanism changes from natural hydrology to engineered operations. The reservoir is a storage basin, but it is also the pressure source for Glen Canyon Dam. The higher the water surface stands above the turbines, the greater the hydraulic head. That pressure helps push water through the penstocks and spin the generating units. As the reservoir falls, the pressure declines. The same quantity of water can produce less electricity because it passes through the turbines with less force. The dam continues to operate, but the operating envelope becomes narrower. Operators have less freedom to change releases without considering elevation. Hydropower output becomes more sensitive to each foot of decline. Equipment that once operated with a broad margin begins working closer to its limits. The lake still looks enormous. The machinery feels the loss first. Below certain elevations, the challenge becomes more serious. The ordinary route through the power plant depends on water reaching the turbine intakes with sufficient pressure and depth. If Powell falls too low, generation becomes unreliable or impossible through those units. Water may still be released through lower outlet structures, but those structures were not intended to replace normal turbine operations indefinitely. They have different capacities, different maintenance requirements, and different operational limits. This is why federal managers focus so closely on a narrow band of elevation near the dam. They are not waiting for Lake Powell to become empty. They are trying to prevent the reservoir from losing one of its principal functions, while it still contains a vast amount of water. The weak point is not the entire lake. It is the relationship between the water surface and a fixed opening in concrete. When forecasts show that Powell may approach that zone, the system responds by reducing the amount released downstream. That action protects elevation. Every acre-foot retained behind Glen Canyon Dam raises Powell slightly above where it would otherwise be. Enough retained water can preserve hydraulic head, support power generation, and maintain more release options. But the mechanism does not end at the dam. It moves through it. Water held at Powell is water that does not enter the Grand Canyon on the previous schedule. The river below receives a smaller volume across the operating year. Tributaries add water along the way, but they do not erase the change made at Glen Canyon Dam. The reduced release continues downstream as a lower contribution to Lake Mead. This is how the same decision produces opposite effects at two reservoirs. Powell gains elevation relative to the earlier plan. Mead loses inflow relative to the earlier plan. The mechanism is not water disappearing. It is water changing function. At Powell, the retained volume becomes vertical margin above critical infrastructure. At Mead, the absent inflow becomes lost support for another reservoir already under pressure. The river connects the two outcomes. By the time the change reaches Lake Mead, it has traveled hundreds of miles and passed through a landscape that makes the original decision difficult to see. There is no label on the water surface showing which acre-feet were retained upstream. Mead simply rises less than it would have risen, remains flat when it might have gained, or declines faster than it otherwise would have declined. That is why reservoir shocks can be politically and emotionally confusing. The cause is a decision made far upstream. The effect is mixed with evaporation, diversions, conservation, local inflows, and weather. No single shoreline mark explains the balance, yet the physical mechanism remains clear. Reduce a major upstream release, and the downstream reservoir receives less support. At Hoover Dam, the same hydraulic principle appears again. Mead's elevation creates the pressure that drives water through Hoover's turbines. As Mead falls, the hydraulic head declines, and each unit of water produces less electricity. The system can compensate to a point. Operators can adjust units. Grid managers can obtain electricity from other sources. Water agencies can conserve. But compensation carries cost. Replacement electricity may be more expensive. It may come from sources with different emissions or reliability profiles. Lower hydropower revenue can weaken funding streams tied to operations, maintenance, and environmental programs. The water shortage, therefore, does not remain inside the reservoir. It moves into the electrical system, the financial system, and the institutions responsible for keeping both working. Then it reaches municipal water infrastructure. Lake Mead supplies major intake systems serving southern Nevada and contributes to the larger network supporting Arizona, California, tribal nations, farms, and communities in Mexico. The deepest intake and low lake-level pumping infrastructure near Las Vegas were designed to preserve access as the reservoir fell. These projects demonstrate that adaptation can work. They also reveal the direction of the stress. Engineers had to move the functional intake lower because the old elevation could no longer be treated as permanent. Pumps must lift water against gravity. Lower water can change energy requirements, operating conditions, and maintenance needs. The public may still turn a faucet and see water, but more machinery may be working to preserve that ordinary result. The event is visible outside. The load accumulates inside pumps, turbines, contracts, and budgets. Agriculture receives the mechanism through a different route. A lower reservoir forecast becomes an allocation discussion. An allocation discussion becomes a delivery estimate. A delivery estimate becomes a planting decision. A farmer deciding whether to grow alfalfa, vegetables, cotton, or no crop at all is responding to water that began as snow in another state. If expected deliveries fall or become uncertain, the farmer may reduce acreage, purchase supplemental water, change crops, or accept payment to conserve. That choice affects workers, equipment suppliers, food processors, transportation companies, and nearby towns. The mechanism moves from atmosphere to soil, from soil to river, from river to reservoir, from reservoir to contract, and from contract to income. By the time it reaches a kitchen table, it may no longer look like hydrology. It may look like a smaller paycheck or a higher price. The same pathway reaches cities through planning rather than sudden failure. Water agencies update demand models. They accelerate conservation programs. They limit ornamental grass. They negotiate storage and banking agreements. They invest in recycling, groundwater recovery, or new treatment systems. These are rational responses, and many can reduce risk. But every response takes money and time. A city can change landscaping rules faster than it can build a major water project. A utility can purchase replacement power faster than it can redesign a dam. A farmer can leave a field unplanted in one season, but a rural economy cannot replace that income instantly. The physical mechanism can move through the river faster than the social system can adapt to it. This is where uncertainty becomes load. No forecast can identify the exact sequence of storms months in advance. Managers must act using ranges of plausible outcomes. If they release too much water from Powell and the next winter is dry, the reservoir may approach critical infrastructure elevations with fewer options. If they retain too much and runoff improves unexpectedly, Mead may have absorbed a larger decline than necessary. There is no action without consequence. The operating problem is not to find a choice with no damage. It is to choose which risk is more immediate, which damage may be reversible, and which threshold cannot safely be crossed. That is why the 6 million acre-foot release is not simply a delivery schedule. It is a judgment about where the system is most fragile now. But a decision made for the present changes the starting point of the future. Lower inflow into Mead means the next dry season begins from a weaker position. Conservation that might once have produced recovery may now only slow decline. A moderate snow year that might once have rebuilt storage may now fill part of the deficit left by the reduced release. The system must work harder to produce the same visible stability. And if another weak runoff year follows before Powell and Mead recover, managers will face the same mechanism with less water, less elevation, and less time. By the time the crisis becomes obvious to the public, the load will already have passed through the entire chain. It begins above the mountains as heat and dry air. It moves into the snowpack, then into thirsty soil. It reaches Powell as missing runoff. It reaches Glen Canyon Dam as a threat to hydraulic head. It becomes a reduced release. It travels through the Grand Canyon as water that is not there on the old schedule. It reaches Mead as lost inflow. It enters Hoover Dam as reduced generating capability. It enters farms and cities as narrower choices. And then it reaches a person. The next question is not whether the mechanism affects people. It is how a change measured in acre-feet enters a specific room, a specific job, and a specific decision that cannot be postponed. The body does not experience a reservoir shortage as an elevation chart. It experiences it as a decision made in a kitchen, a field, a control room, or a hospital budget, long after the water has failed to arrive. To see how the mechanism travels through a person, begin with a farm worker in the lower Colorado River Basin at the start of a planting season. The worker does not stand beside Lake Powell. He may never see Glen Canyon Dam. His day begins hundreds of miles downstream, where an irrigation district has received a tighter delivery estimate, and a farm manager is deciding which fields can still be planted. The first sign of the shortage is not an empty canal. It is a field left dry on purpose. The land is still there. The equipment is still there. The workers are still available. What is missing is the confidence that enough water will arrive at the right time to justify the crop. That decision began as weak runoff in the mountains. It moved into Lake Powell as missing inflow. It became a smaller release through Glen Canyon Dam. It reached Lake Mead as reduced support. Then it entered an allocation plan. Now it has reached a person through a work schedule. Fewer planted acres can mean fewer shifts, preparing soil, maintaining irrigation lines, harvesting, packing, and transporting crops. The hydrology becomes income before it becomes hunger. A family may first feel the shortage through a smaller paycheck, delayed rent, a postponed medical visit, or less money for electricity during the hottest months of the year. The reservoir remains far away, but the mechanism is already inside the home. This is the first human pathway. Water moves from snow into soil, from soil into river, from river into storage, from storage into a delivery estimate, and from that estimate into a household budget. The danger is not only that less water exists, it is that uncertainty changes decisions before the final volume is known. A farmer may reduce acreage not because every gallon has disappeared, but because the risk of running short halfway through the season has become too high. A crop cannot be protected by water that might arrive too late. A worker cannot recover wages from a field that was never planted. The physical shortage and the economic shortage therefore do not begin at the same moment. The economic shortage often arrives first. Now move from the farm to a municipal water control room. An operator watches pressure, demand, pumping rates, reservoir storage, and treatment capacity. The public rarely notices this room because its success is measured by silence. Water appears at the tap. Pressure remains steady. Treatment standards are met. But when Lake Mead falls, the operator's job becomes less forgiving. Lower reservoir elevations can change pumping conditions. Demand during hot weather can rise at the same time conservation targets become more urgent. Equipment must continue working while maintenance windows narrow. The operator does not experience the shortage as a dramatic collapse. The shortage appears as less flexibility. A pump that could once be taken offline during a low demand period may now need a more carefully scheduled backup. A power interruption becomes more serious because lifting and moving water requires reliable electricity. A forecast error becomes more costly because the system has less storage margin. The weak point is not always a broken pipe. It can be the final available pump being asked to carry normal demand while another unit is under repair. That is how reservoir decline enters a city. It does not need to empty the system. It only needs to remove enough redundancy that an ordinary equipment problem becomes an emergency. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside the operating margin. For a household, this may still look manageable. A new watering schedule, a higher utility bill, a request to remove ornamental grass, a rebate for efficient fixtures. These measures can appear small compared with the scale of the river, but they are the final end of a long transmission chain. A reduced release upstream has entered the home as a rule about when a sprinkler can run. The household may adapt easily, or it may not. A family in a detached house with savings can replace landscaping and install efficient equipment. A renter in an older apartment has fewer choices. A small business with outdoor cooling, cleaning, food preparation, or landscaping needs may face costs that cannot be avoided. Scarcity does not arrive evenly because control over water use is not distributed evenly. Some users can invest their way around a restriction, others absorb it directly. The same pattern appears in electricity. As Mead falls, Hoover Dam can generate less power from the same flow because the water has less height behind it. The grid can replace that electricity, but replacement is not invisible. A utility may purchase power from another source. That source may cost more. It may be less flexible during peak demand. It may depend on transmission lines already carrying heavy loads. The household does not see hydraulic head. It sees an electric bill, a conservation request, or a greater risk during extreme heat. For an older person living alone, that risk can become physical. Air conditioning is not a luxury during a severe heat event. It is part of the body's cooling system. If electricity becomes more expensive, some households reduce use. If the grid is under strain, outages become more dangerous. A water shortage that reduces hydropower can therefore enter the body as heat. The body does not experience climate change as a graph. It experiences it as a room that does not cool at night. This does not mean a lower Powell release directly causes a medical emergency in one home. The evidence does not support such a simple chain. It means the release enters a larger system where water, power, cost, and heat are connected. Each connection adds load. The person at the end feels the combined result, not the original decision. Consider a nurse working an evening shift at a hospital during a hot summer week. The hospital depends on reliable water for sanitation, cooling, sterilization, food service, and patient care. It depends on electricity for ventilation, medication storage, monitoring equipment, elevators, and emergency systems. The nurse may never hear the phrase 6 million acre-feet during the shift, but the hospital's utility costs, backup planning, and emergency readiness are shaped by the systems behind that number. If regional power becomes more expensive or less flexible, the hospital pays more to preserve the same level of service. If water agencies tighten conservation, facilities must reduce non-essential use without compromising hygiene. If extreme heat drives more patients into emergency departments, demand rises, while the infrastructure supporting the hospital is under greater stress. The reservoir shortage does not need to cut off the hospital to affect it. It can increase the cost of keeping the hospital ordinary. That distinction matters because modern systems often fail financially or operationally before they fail physically. A building may still have water and power, but the effort required to guarantee both keeps rising. Staff time moves toward contingency planning. Budgets move toward backup equipment. Maintenance is delayed elsewhere. A resilient system can absorb some of this. Repeated load consumes that resilience. The human pathway also runs through tribal communities whose rights, infrastructure, and access to Colorado River water are not equal across the basin. Some communities hold legally recognized water rights, but still lack the pipelines, treatment plants, or funding needed to use the full benefit of those rights. For them, the crisis is not only how much water remains in the river, it is whether the infrastructure exists to deliver safe water at all. A reservoir operating decision enters this context differently than it enters a wealthy metropolitan utility. The same acre-foot can have different human value, depending on whether a community already has storage, treatment, backup wells, legal certainty, and financial capacity. Scarcity exposes those differences. It does not create every inequality, but it can deepen them. The system may report one basin-wide shortage while people experience several different emergencies. One household receives a landscaping restriction. Another receives a boil notice after a small system loses pressure. A farmer receives a reduced delivery. A tribal family continues hauling water because infrastructure promised years earlier is still incomplete. The water problem becomes a governance problem because access depends on more than hydrology. There is another person inside the mechanism who is easy to overlook: the dam operator. At Glen Canyon Dam, crews manage releases while watching reservoir elevation, equipment condition, forecast uncertainty, and downstream requirements. Their decisions are constrained by physics. Releasing more water can support Mead but lower Powell. Releasing less can protect Powell but shift stress downstream. An operator cannot solve the shortage by choosing the correct valve setting. The system does not offer a painless setting. Every adjustment protects one function and weakens another. The human burden here is responsibility. Decisions must be made before the future is known. If runoff improves, a protective action may later appear too cautious. If runoff collapses, the same action may appear insufficient. Operational work under scarcity means acting inside uncertainty, while knowing that millions of people are attached to the outcome. That pressure moves through agencies just as water moves through the river. Analysts revise forecasts. Engineers test equipment. Lawyers interpret agreements. State officials negotiate reductions. Local agencies explain new rules to the public. The shortage becomes meetings, models, deadlines, and conflict long before it becomes an empty intake. Then the mechanism returns to the household. A family receives a notice asking for lower outdoor use. At first, The request seems disconnected from Lake Powell. Their tap still works. The swimming pool down the street may still be full. Construction may continue. Agriculture may still consume large volumes. The family asks a reasonable question. Why should this small change matter? The answer is not that one household can refill Mead. It cannot. The answer is that large water systems are shaped by millions of repeated actions. But those actions only matter when institutions distribute responsibility fairly and reduce the largest avoidable losses. Conservation that falls mainly on households, while major users remain unchanged, will lose trust. Conservation that ignores vulnerable communities can cause harm. Conservation that is temporary, while the hydrology has changed permanently, can create only the appearance of response. The human pathway, therefore, includes legitimacy. People are more likely to accept difficult changes when they understand the mechanism, see accurate evidence, and believe the burden is shared. Trust becomes part of water infrastructure. Without it, even technically sound plans can fail. This is why the story cannot end with a farmer, a household, or a dam operator. Each person is connected to a larger structure that determines how much risk reaches them. The farm worker depends on irrigation policy and labor markets. The nurse depends on utility, reliability, and hospital budgets. The renter depends on the decisions of a landlord and a city. The dam operator depends on federal rules and hydrologic forecasts. The household depends on whether conservation is designed as a shared strategy or a public relations exercise. Water moves physically through the river, but damage moves through institutions. And institutions determine who receives warning, who receives protection, and who receives the remaining load. The 6 million acre-foot release becomes real when it changes a choice that a person cannot avoid: whether to plant, whether to run the air conditioner, whether to delay a bill, whether to keep a pump online, whether to spend public money on a deeper intake instead of another need, whether to hold water at Powell while Mead falls faster. These are not separate stories. They are the same mechanism arriving at different human locations, but the chain still depends on one smaller piece of infrastructure that can turn pressure into failure. To find it, we have to stop looking at the entire river and identify the specific component that carries more responsibility as the margin disappears. The weak point is not the whole Colorado River system. The weak point is the narrow vertical space between a reservoir surface and the fixed openings, pumps, turbines, and intake structures that were built for a different range of conditions. That space can be measured in feet, and when it shrinks, a system that still appears massive begins to lose functions one by one. At Lake Powell, the critical component is not simply the dam. It is the relationship between the water elevation and the power plant intakes inside Glen Canyon Dam. Under normal conditions, water enters the penstocks with enough depth and pressure to drive the turbines, generate electricity, and move downstream through the dam's primary operating route. The reservoir surface above those intakes creates hydraulic head. That head is invisible from the shoreline, but it is the force that makes the power plant work. As Powell falls, the pressure declines. The plant can still operate, but each foot of lost elevation reduces the energy available to push water through the turbines. Output falls, efficiency changes, operational flexibility narrows. Then the reservoir approaches a more dangerous band, where the turbines can no longer be treated as a reliable release route. The weak point is not that the lake has run out of water. The weak point is that the water is no longer high enough above the machinery designed to use it. This is the difference between storage and usable storage. A reservoir may still contain millions of acre-feet, while the dam loses the ability to release that water in the ordinary way. Below the power pool, operators must rely more heavily on lower river outlet works, often described as bypass tubes. These structures can move water downstream without generating electricity. They are essential backup infrastructure. But backup infrastructure is not the same as normal infrastructure. It has different flow limits, different wear patterns, different maintenance needs, and a different operating history. A system designed to use those outlets occasionally becomes more vulnerable if they must carry the main release for a prolonged period. The weak point is not only the concrete opening, It is the moment when an emergency pathway becomes the everyday pathway. That is why federal managers have focused so intensely on protecting Lake Powell above critical infrastructure elevations. The goal is to preserve more than power production. It is to preserve options. As long as the turbines remain available, operators have more control over how water is released. They can generate electricity while meeting downstream flow requirements. They can respond more flexibly to changing demand and river conditions. If that route is lost, every remaining option carries more strain. Less electricity is produced. More water must pass through structures that provide no hydropower revenue. Maintenance becomes more urgent. A failure in one outlet becomes more serious because fewer alternatives remain. Redundancy disappears before the water does. This is how a small component can determine the behavior of an entire basin. The reservoir may stretch for miles, but the system can still depend on a limited number of openings inside one dam. The map shows a vast lake. The risk sits inside a narrow piece of concrete and steel. Now follow the same principle downstream to Lake Mead. Hoover Dam has its own critical relationship between water elevation, turbine performance, intake access, and release capacity. As Mead falls, the water pressure above the turbines weakens. The plant continues generating, but its maximum capacity declines. This matters because Hoover Dam is not merely an energy source measured by annual output. Hydropower can respond quickly. It can increase or reduce generation to help balance the grid. That flexibility is especially useful when electricity demand rises sharply or when other sources fluctuate. When Mead loses elevation, the grid does not only lose megawatts, it loses part of a fast-responding tool. The weak point therefore expands from a turbine to an electrical network. A smaller amount of dependable power at Hoover can require utilities to purchase replacement electricity. That electricity may be more expensive. It may come from farther away. It may depend on transmission lines that are already constrained during high demand. A reservoir decline becomes a grid margin problem. The water system and the power system begin sharing the same weakness, and power is required to move water. Pumps lift water into canals, treatment plants, storage tanks, and urban distribution networks. If hydropower declines, the system may need more electricity from elsewhere to move the same water. The shortage creates a loop. Lower water reduces hydropower. Lower hydropower can increase the cost of pumping and delivering water. Higher operating costs consume budgets that could have been used for maintenance or adaptation. The physical weakness becomes a financial weakness. Then the financial weakness returns to the infrastructure. This is why a reservoir crisis can deepen without a single dramatic failure. The system becomes more expensive to keep stable. At Lake Mead, one of the most visible responses to falling elevation has been the construction of deeper intake and pumping infrastructure serving southern Nevada. These projects were designed so that water could still be drawn if the lake dropped below older intake elevations. They are powerful examples of adaptation. They reduce the chance that a city loses access simply because the shoreline moved. But they also reveal the true weak point. The original intake elevation could no longer be treated as secure. Engineers had to move the functional access point lower. The system survived by building beneath its previous assumptions. That is resilience. It is also a warning. Every time critical infrastructure must be redesigned around a lower reservoir, the old operating margin is permanently acknowledged as unreliable. The backup becomes the baseline. And once the deepest intake is carrying more responsibility, its own pumps, power supply, maintenance schedule, and emergency generators become more important, the weak point does not disappear. It moves deeper and becomes more concentrated. Imagine a low lake-level pumping station operating through a prolonged heat wave. Electricity demand across the region is high. Water demand also rises. Pumps must continue lifting water while the reservoir provides less natural pressure. Maintenance cannot be delayed forever, but taking equipment offline becomes harder when fewer units can carry the load. A transformer fault, control system problem, or unexpected vibration that would once have been manageable can become urgent because the system has less redundancy. The failure is not caused by low water alone. It is created by low water interacting with an ordinary equipment problem. That is what makes system risk difficult to communicate. People often imagine catastrophe as an extreme force breaking a strong structure. More often, a stressed system fails when a routine problem arrives after the margin has already been consumed. The weak point is the ordinary component that no longer has backup. The same pattern exists in agricultural delivery systems. A large irrigation network may depend on a specific pumping plant, canal gate, siphon, or scheduling window. Under abundant conditions, operators can move water around a maintenance problem or adjust the timing of deliveries. Under shortage, the schedule is tighter. A delayed release can miss a crop's most sensitive growth stage. A pump outage can affect more acres because each remaining delivery is carrying greater economic importance. The weak point may be a single station connecting a river diversion to a canal. If that station operates with less water, more sediment, higher energy costs, or fewer maintenance windows, the entire delivery district becomes less flexible. Farmers do not need the whole canal to fail. They only need water to arrive after the crop can use it. Timing becomes infrastructure. The vulnerable component is not always made of steel. Sometimes it is a planting window. A similar weakness appears in cities. Urban water systems are designed with storage tanks, pressure zones, treatment plants, pumps, backup power, and interconnections. These systems are built to handle equipment failures because failures are expected, but they assume a certain amount of spare capacity. When regional water supplies tighten, summer demand rises, and energy costs increase, spare capacity can shrink. A treatment plant may still produce enough water under average demand, but struggle during a heat-driven peak. A pump station may be adequate while all units are operating, but vulnerable when one unit is down for repair. A storage tank may provide hours of backup rather than days. The weak point is not the city's total water supply. It is the moment when one neighborhood, one pressure zone, or one facility loses redundancy. A hospital at the end of that pressure zone does not experience a basin-wide shortage as an abstract percentage. It experiences low pressure, a delayed repair, or a contingency plan activated because one pump is no longer enough. The weak point is small, the consequences are not. This is why the 6 million acre-foot release cannot be evaluated only by asking whether enough water remains in Powell or Mead. The deeper question is whether the infrastructure attached to those reservoirs still has room to absorb a second problem. A dry year is one load, a turbine outage is another, a heat wave is another, a transmission failure is another, a maintenance backlog is another. Systems are designed to manage individual problems. They become vulnerable when several arrive, while the margin is already thin. The reservoir does not need to reach dead pool for the system to lose reliability. It only needs to approach the elevation where one more failure removes the final alternative. That is the infrastructure threshold that matters. At Glen Canyon Dam, it is the loss of normal turbine operations and increased dependence on lower outlets. At Hoover Dam, it is declining hydraulic head and reduced generating capability. In southern Nevada, it is the growing dependence on the deepest intake and low lake level pumping system. In agriculture, it is the pumping plant or delivery window that cannot be replaced once missed. In a city, it is the pressure zone with no remaining backup. These are separate components, but they share one pattern. Each was built to carry part of the system. As reservoirs decline, each begins carrying more than its original share. The weak point is not always broken. Sometimes it is simply overcommitted. And overcommitment can remain invisible until the next ordinary failure arrives. That is why protecting Powell by reducing releases may be operationally necessary while still increasing downstream risk. The decision preserves one set of critical elevations at Glen Canyon Dam. It also leaves Mead with less inflow to support another set of critical elevations at Hoover Dam and the intake systems below. The system is not choosing between safety and danger. It is choosing which weak point receives the next increment of protection and which weak point receives the next increment of load. That is a more difficult reality than a simple shortage. It means the river is now being managed as a chain of thresholds. One reservoir approaches a limit. Water is moved or retained to defend it. Another reservoir loses support. Its infrastructure becomes more sensitive. A new intervention is considered. Each action buys time at one location by using time somewhere else. The entire basin begins to depend on whether those interventions can be made before the next threshold is crossed. The smallest component, therefore, becomes the most important question. Not how much water remains in total, but which intake, turbine, pump, outlet, canal gate, or operating window is carrying the system with the least margin left. That is where the next failure would begin. Not with the entire Colorado River collapsing at once, but with one ordinary piece of infrastructure being asked to do one extraordinary thing for too long. And this is not a theoretical concern. Versions of this mechanism have already appeared during earlier years of severe reservoir decline, when emergency releases, shortage declarations, power losses, and infrastructure adaptations revealed how quickly a narrow operating margin can become a basin-wide problem. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. In the summer of 2021, the Colorado River system began revealing what happens when reservoir margin becomes more valuable than the water scheduled to move through it. Lake Powell was falling toward elevations that threatened hydropower production and ordinary dam operations. The response was not limited to a warning. Federal operators began moving stored water from reservoirs farther upstream. Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming and Utah, Blue Mesa Reservoir in Colorado, and Navajo Reservoir in New Mexico were drawn into a coordinated drought response designed to protect Powell. That year, approximately 161,000 acre-feet of additional water was released from upstream units. The action was intended to defend a target elevation at Lake Powell, not to refill the reservoir or end the drought. It was emergency support measured in feet of operating space. The important detail was not only that Powell needed water, it was where that water had to come from. The system protected one reservoir by drawing down others. Scarcity did not disappear. It moved. In January of 2022, operators adjusted releases from Glen Canyon Dam to hold back another 350,000 acre-feet in Lake Powell. Then, beginning in May, the drought response expanded. Approximately 500,000 acre-feet of additional water was scheduled to move from Flaming Gorge toward Powell. Combined with the water retained by reducing releases through Glen Canyon Dam, the two actions were expected to preserve roughly 1 million acre-feet of storage at Powell, equal to about 16 feet of reservoir elevation at the time. 16 feet does not sound large beside the walls of Glen Canyon. Operationally, it was the difference between more room and fewer options. It was water being used as distance above a threshold. The action demonstrated the mechanism at the center of the current story. Water released from Flaming Gorge became protection at Powell. Water retained at Powell became water that did not move toward Mead on the earlier schedule. Every intervention created a benefit at one location and a consequence somewhere else. The river was no longer being managed only as a sequence of deliveries. It was being managed as a chain of vulnerable elevations. The year 2022 made the weakness visible because Lake Powell approached the minimum power pool zone more closely than it ever had since the reservoir first filled. Minimum power pool is the elevation below which Glen Canyon Dam can no longer generate hydropower through its turbines in the normal way. It is not dead pool. Water still remains behind the dam. But the reservoir loses one of the functions around which the structure was built. The power plant becomes unavailable. Release capacity becomes more restricted. Lower outlet works must carry greater responsibility. Revenue from hydropower declines. Grid operators lose a flexible source of electricity. The system still contains water, yet the infrastructure attached to that water becomes less capable. That was the precedent. The crisis was not an empty lake. It was a lake approaching the point where stored water and usable water were no longer the same thing. Downstream, Lake Mead was revealing the other half of the mechanism. In August of 2021, federal officials declared the first official shortage condition for the lower Colorado River Basin for calendar year 2022. The declaration triggered reductions and conservation contributions, with Arizona receiving the largest scheduled reduction, followed by Nevada and Mexico under the existing operating agreements. Those cuts did not mean every household lost water. They moved first through legal priorities, agricultural deliveries, state plans, and water agency operations. The shortage entered fields and budgets before it entered most homes. Then the projections worsened. For calendar year 2023, Lake Mead was placed in its first level 2, a shortage condition. The name sounded administrative. The physical signal was simple. The reservoir had fallen far enough that deeper reductions were required. Arizona faced a reduction of 592,000 acre-feet, approximately 21% of its annual apportionment. Nevada faced a reduction of 25,000 acre-feet. Mexico faced a reduction of 104,000 acre-feet under the binational shortage framework. California did not receive a required shortage reduction at that tier under the existing priority system, though conservation actions and negotiations continued across the basin. This difference exposed a central truth about system risk. The river can experience one hydrologic shortage, while users experience different legal and economic consequences. Water does not move through the basin according to physical need alone. It moves through compacts, court decisions, treaties, contracts, priorities, infrastructure, and political agreements. The drought entered the reservoir as a shared loss. It left the reservoir as an uneven burden. The precedent became more serious in the summer of 2022, when federal officials called for a vast additional reduction in consumptive use across the basin. The range discussed was 2 million to 4 million acre-feet per year beyond existing actions. That was not a formal allocation imposed in one moment. It was an estimate of the scale of conservation believed necessary to protect critical reservoir elevations. The size of the number revealed how far the system had moved beyond ordinary shortage management. Previous rules had been designed to reduce deliveries in steps as Mead fell, but the reservoirs were declining rapidly enough that the scheduled steps appeared too slow for the physical system. The calendar of governance was falling behind the calendar of hydrology. Negotiations required time. Water levels continued moving. Every month spent deciding who would conserve left less elevation available to absorb another weak runoff year. This is the same tension now appearing around the 6 million acre-foot release. Operators can move faster than a basin-wide legal agreement by changing releases and coordinating federal reservoirs. But rapid operational action cannot settle the deeper question of who ultimately absorbs the shortage. It can buy time. It cannot manufacture consensus. Then, the winter of 2022 into 2023 changed the picture. Snow accumulated across the upper basin. Runoff improved dramatically compared with the previous year. Lake Powell rose. The immediate threat to critical power elevations eased. Water previously released from Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa under drought response operations could begin to be recovered through later adjustments. By the end of April 2024, federal plans expected those upstream reservoirs to recover the additional volumes they had provided during 2021 and 2022. On the surface, this looked like proof that emergency actions had worked. In one sense, they had. The system had preserved Powell long enough for a stronger runoff season to arrive. Critical infrastructure remained available. Operators gained time. But that outcome also created a dangerous misunderstanding. A wet season did not erase the mechanism. It interrupted it. The reservoirs remained far below their historic high levels. One strong runoff year improved storage, without restoring the broad margin that existed before the long decline. The emergency had been delayed, not permanently solved. This difference matters when comparing the precedent with the present. In 2022, managers reduced Glen Canyon Dam releases and sent additional water from Flaming Gorge because Powell was approaching a dangerous infrastructure elevation. The current 6 million acre-foot release follows the same operational logic. Powell is again being protected by retaining more water and drawing support from upstream storage. Mead again receives less water than it would under a higher Powell release. Hoover Dam again faces declining hydraulic head as the downstream reservoir loses elevation. The mechanism is familiar because the river has already performed it, but the current configuration is not identical. The earlier emergency was followed by an unusually strong runoff season that created temporary relief. No operator can assume that rescue will repeat on schedule. The starting conditions have also changed. Reservoirs, agencies, and water users have already spent part of their financial, political, and physical capacity responding to the previous crisis. Conservation programs have been funded, infrastructure has been modified, fields have been fallowed, agreements have been negotiated. Upstream reservoirs have already been used as emergency support. A repeated intervention does not occur in a fresh system. It occurs in a system carrying the memory and cost of the last intervention. The precedent also shows that reducing water use can alter the trajectory. Beginning in 2023, major conservation agreements in the lower basin paid irrigation districts, tribes, cities, and other users to leave water in the system. Federal funding supported temporary reductions intended to protect Mead, while longer-term operating rules were developed. Those actions, combined with improved hydrology, slowed the decline and helped strengthen reservoir elevations. This evidence matters because it prevents the story from becoming fatalistic. Human decisions can change the water balance. Conservation is not symbolic when it produces verified reductions in consumptive use. 1 million acre-feet left in a reservoir is physically real. It can preserve elevation, power capacity, and time. But the precedent also shows the limitation of temporary programs. A payment that reduces use for one season does not automatically change demand for the next decade. A field left unplanted for compensation may return to production when the agreement ends. A city can remove grass permanently, but it cannot reduce every form of demand at the same speed. Emergency conservation can defend a threshold. Durable conservation must change the baseline. The river needs both, and the two are not interchangeable. Another lesson came from hydropower. As Powell and Mead declined, Glen Canyon and Hoover produced less electricity than they could at higher elevations. The dams did not fail in a single dramatic moment. Their capability weakened gradually. Lower hydraulic head reduced the amount of energy available from each acre-foot passing through the turbines. Power customers and federal agencies had to account for replacement electricity and lower revenues. This was not a side effect detached from the water crisis. It was one of the ways the crisis multiplied. Hydropower revenue supports operations, maintenance, and environmental programs. When generation falls, the financial structure around the dams also feels the decline. The precedent proved that elevation is not merely a water supply measurement, it is an energy measurement and a budget measurement. A falling lake transfers pressure into systems that do not look like reservoirs. Most importantly, the years from 2021 through 2023 showed how close the basin came to, depending on perfect timing. Emergency water was moved from upstream reservoirs. Releases from Powell were reduced. Shortages were declared at Mead. Calls for enormous conservation were issued. Then, a strong snow year arrived, before Powell crossed its most dangerous operating threshold. The system received time from weather after purchasing time through emergency operations. That combination prevented a worse outcome. But a system that survives because several protective actions and one favorable season align has not demonstrated unlimited resilience. It has demonstrated how narrow the escape route has become. The lesson is not that collapse was inevitable then or is inevitable now. The lesson is that the mechanism has already been tested under real conditions. Water was moved between reservoirs. Deliveries were reduced. Power capacity declined. Governments paid users to conserve. Infrastructure thresholds shaped basin-wide decisions. And one reservoir was protected partly by shifting load to another part of the system. That is the evidence left behind. The present 6 million acre-foot release is not a copy of 2022, and history does not promise the same result. The hydrology may improve. Conservation may offset part of the downstream loss. New operating agreements may distribute risk more effectively. But the precedent removes one comforting argument. We can no longer say that the transfer of scarcity is only a model or a theory. The Colorado River has already shown how it behaves when the margin becomes thin. It reaches upstream for stored water. It holds more at Powell. It sends less toward Mead. It reduces power, narrows deliveries, and forces institutions to purchase time. The unanswered question is whether those emergency actions remain temporary tools or whether they are becoming the normal operating pattern of a river entering a different regime. This is not only a reduced release from Lake Powell, it is a signal that the Colorado River is entering a different operating regime. For most of the modern reservoir era, managers could treat severe shortages as departures from a recognizable baseline. A wet sequence could refill part of the storage lost during a dry sequence. Rules could be organized around fixed elevation bands. Emergency actions could be described as temporary bridges back toward normal conditions. But the 6 million acre-foot release exposes a harder possibility. The system may no longer be moving around one stable center. The center itself may be shifting. A river, once managed around predictable seasonal recovery, is increasingly being managed around the risk that recovery will not arrive before the next load. That is not simply a drought problem. It is a calendar failure. The dams, contracts, power systems, agricultural schedules, and shortage rules were built around assumptions about when water would arrive, how much snow would become runoff, and how long reservoirs would have to rebuild between severe years. Those assumptions are now being tested by a watershed that can produce less river flow from similar-looking snow conditions. Warmer air increases the amount of water demanded by soil, vegetation, and the atmosphere. Earlier, melting changes the timing of runoff. Longer warm seasons extend evaporation and plant water use. A winter that appears ordinary on a snow map can therefore deliver an extraordinary disappointment at the reservoir. The old calendar says spring is the recovery season. The new pattern asks whether spring will deliver enough usable runoff to create recovery at all. That change reaches every institution attached to the river. Reservoir rules were built to translate elevation into action. When Lake Mead falls through one band, one level of shortage applies. When Lake Powell begins the year within a certain range, a release tier is selected. This structure creates predictability, and predictability is essential for cities, farms, power customers, tribes, and governments planning years ahead. But a rule based on annual starting elevation can become less protective when conditions deteriorate rapidly after the decision is made. That is what the current intervention reveals. The original water year release was set using the operating framework and reservoir projections available before the runoff season fully unfolded. Then, the hydrology worsened. Federal officials used additional authority to reduce the release from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6 million, and to bring more water toward Powell from Flaming Gorge. The system had to modify an annual plan because the physical river moved faster than the original plan could safely absorb. The rules did not disappear, but emergency flexibility became necessary inside them. This is how temporary measures begin resembling a new baseline. First, an exceptional action is used to protect a critical elevation. Then, another dry period requires the same tool. Upstream storage is moved toward Powell. Releases toward Mead are reduced. Conservation is purchased downstream. Infrastructure is modified to function at lower water levels. Each intervention is justified by immediate conditions. Together, they form a pattern. The river system survives by repeatedly borrowing water, money, electricity, and time from one location to protect another. The danger is not that these actions are ineffective. Many of them work. The danger is that successful emergency measures can hide the disappearance of the conditions that once made emergencies rare. A deeper intake keeps water moving, so the city appears secure. A release from Flaming Gorge protects Powell, so the power plant remains available. Paid conservation slows Mead's decline, so deliveries continue. But beneath that stability, The system is becoming more dependent on interventions that consume resources elsewhere. The backup is becoming the operating plan. The calendar is not the only thing changing. The meaning of abundance is changing too. 6 million acre-feet is physically enormous. Yet it can represent scarcity when it is smaller than the release expected by the downstream system and larger than the natural inflow reaching the upstream reservoir. An average snow year can represent shortage if warm soils and high atmospheric demand prevent enough water from reaching the river. A reservoir containing millions of acre-feet can represent infrastructure risk if its surface is too close to turbine or intake thresholds. Traditional measurements remain necessary, but their meaning depends increasingly on context. Volume without elevation can mislead. Snow without runoff efficiency can mislead. Annual supply without conservation without permanence can mislead. The new operating regime requires managers to measure not only how much water exists, but what functions that water can still support, and for how long. This also changes the geography of risk. The shortage begins in the upper basin watershed, where missing runoff reduces the inflow to Powell. It then moves toward fixed infrastructure at Glen Canyon Dam. Protective operations transfer part of the load upstream to Flaming Gorge and downstream to Mead. Lower Mead elevations transfer load into Hoover Dam, municipal pumping systems, irrigation deliveries, and power purchases. Conservation transfers part of the burden to farms, cities, tribes, businesses, and households. No location experiences the whole crisis at once. Each receives one part of it. This allows the basin to continue operating, but it can also obscure the full pattern. A farmer sees a reduced delivery. A power customer sees a changed rate. A recreation business sees a closed ramp. A city sees a conservation target. An upstream community sees a reservoir decline caused partly by water sent to protect Powell. Each impact can be discussed separately. Together, they reveal a system distributing scarcity across geography to prevent concentrated failure. The political difficulty begins when the distribution of that scarcity becomes the main operating question. The Bureau of Reclamation is moving toward new guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, after the existing interim framework reaches the end of its current term. The draft federal process examines several operating alternatives, but the basin states have not reached full agreement on a single approach. That disagreement is not merely a conflict over percentages. It reflects different understandings of responsibility, legal priority, hydrologic risk, and the meaning of fairness under a shrinking supply. Upper basin states argue that much of their use depends directly on variable natural flow, and that they cannot release water that does not exist. Lower basin states point to the enormous scale of established cities, farms, and infrastructure dependent on Mead. Tribal nations hold significant rights and interests, but have not always received equal access to decision-making, infrastructure, or the water recognized on paper. Mexico is connected into new rules must somehow remance just the effects of shortage and conservation. The river is physically ownified and institutionally divided. New rules must somehow operate across both realities. This is why the future cannot be decided only by selecting a new elevation chart. A durable framework must respond when hydrology changes faster than annual rules. It must define who reduces use when reductions begin, how conservation is verified, and how emergency water moved between reservoirs will be repaid or replaced. It must distinguish between water withdrawn and water consumed, because some water returns to the river while some is lost to crops, landscapes, products, or evaporation. It must account for uncertainty without waiting until uncertainty becomes failure. And it must preserve enough flexibility to protect infrastructure without turning every emergency decision into an unresolved argument over who was harmed downstream. The existing system was built to allocate water. The emerging system must also allocate risk. That distinction changes preparation. Under the old calendar, agencies could plan for a dry year, apply shortage rules, and expect future recovery to restore some margin. Under the new pattern, Preparation must assume that another dry year can arrive before the previous loss is repaired. Maintenance schedules must account for equipment operating longer at low elevations. Power planning must account for reduced hydropower capability during periods of high regional demand. Agricultural planning must account for water uncertainty before seeds are purchased and workers are hired. Cities must treat conservation not as a temporary public campaign, but as permanent system design. Wastewater reuse, leak reduction, groundwater banking, landscape change, and pricing structures become part of long-term supply, not emergency decoration. The question is no longer how to endure one bad season. It is how to operate when the interval between bad seasons is shorter than the time required to recover. This does not mean every part of the Southwest is moving toward the same outcome. Some cities have reduced per-person water use, even while populations increased. Some irrigation districts have improved efficiency. Some tribes and rural communities are developing projects that can finally convert legal rights into reliable access. Conservation agreements can leave measurable water in reservoirs. Better forecasting can provide earlier warning. New infrastructure can protect supplies at lower elevations. These are real forms of adaptation. But adaptation can create its own blind spot when continued service is mistaken for restored security. A city that can pump from a lower lake is better protected against intake failure. It is not protected against every consequence of a shrinking reservoir. A farm that installs efficient irrigation can produce more value from each delivered acre-foot. It may still face a reduction too large for efficiency alone to absorb. A dam modified to release water at lower elevations may preserve downstream flow. It may not replace the power, revenue, and flexibility lost with the turbines. Adaptation changes the threshold. It does not eliminate the water balance. The new baseline, if it is emerging, will therefore be defined less by one permanent reservoir elevation than by continuous intervention. Water will be moved between reservoirs. Demands will be adjusted more frequently. Conservation will be measured against increasingly narrow margins. Forecasts will carry greater political and financial weight. Infrastructure once considered backup will operate more often. The river may continue serving millions of people, but the effort required to produce that stability will rise. Stability will no longer mean the absence of stress. It will mean that stress is being actively managed before the public sees failure. That is the system pattern behind the 6 million acre-foot release. Powell is protected because its margin is thin. Mead feels the shock because its margin is also thin. Flaming Gorge is asked to contribute because storage farther upstream remains available. Lower basin users are asked to conserve because operational changes alone cannot create water. Federal officials are developing new rules because the old framework was not designed to govern the river indefinitely under these conditions. The Colorado River is not simply passing through another dry year. It is being forced to decide which assumptions from the previous century can still survive. The event is a smaller release. The system signal is much larger. A river built around recovery is being managed around the possibility of repeated non-recovery. A reservoir network designed to store abundance is increasingly being used to distribute shortage. And a set of temporary protections is becoming the architecture of daily operations. The future will not turn only on whether the next winter is wet or dry. It will turn on whether new rules can reduce demand, protect infrastructure, recognize unequal vulnerability, and preserve enough margin before another weak runoff season arrives. But that conclusion requires one final boundary. The evidence shows a system under increasing strain. It does not prove that every future failure is inevitable, that every decline has one cause, or that one operating decision alone determines Mead's fate. Before the warning can be trusted, we must separate what the data establishes from what the story might tempt us to assume. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. The Bureau of Reclamation has confirmed a water year release of 6 million acre-feet from Lake Powell, 1.48 million acre-feet below the earlier operating projection. Federal studies show exceptionally weak inflow into Powell. Additional water is being moved from Flaming Gorge to help protect critical elevations upstream. Lake Mead is already operating under shortage conditions downstream. And Reclamation has stated that reducing the Powell release will accelerate the decline of Mead compared with the earlier schedule. Those are established facts. They do not require a prediction of immediate collapse. They do not prove that taps across the southwest are about to run dry. They do not mean Hoover Dam will suddenly stop operating. They show something more precise and more useful. The system has reached a condition in which protecting one major reservoir requires accepting greater pressure at another. This is not just a smaller release. This is a reservoir shock being transferred downstream. But the evidence line matters because the Colorado River is not controlled by one number or one decision. Lake Mead does not rise or fall only because of releases from Lake Powell. Water also enters between the two reservoirs through tributaries. Water leaves Mead through deliveries, releases, evaporation, and other losses. Conservation can slow the decline. Changes in agricultural use can alter demand. Weather can raise or lower evaporation. A stronger future runoff season can improve the balance. A weaker season can make it worse. The 6 million acre-foot release changes one major part of the equation. It does not control every part. Saying that Mead feels the shock is supported. Saying that this action alone determines Mead's future would not be. The same boundary applies to climate. Rising temperatures and prolonged drying have contributed to lower river flows and weaker runoff efficiency across the basin. Warmer conditions can increase evaporation, dry soils, extend growing seasons, and reduce the share of snow that reaches streams. But no single dry month, individual storm, or operating decision can be attributed to one cause without specific analysis. Natural variability still matters. Ocean and atmospheric patterns still alter precipitation from year to year. A wet winter remains possible. A severe drought year remains possible. Climate change does not remove variability. It changes the background conditions within which that variability operates. The warning is not that every future year will be drier than the one before it. The warning is that the system can receive less recovery from a similar-looking season, and that another weak year can arrive before the reservoirs rebuild the margin lost during the last one. The evidence also does not show that the Colorado River system is helpless. Cities have reduced per-person water use. Farmers, tribal nations, irrigation districts, and municipalities have participated in conservation programs that left measurable water in Lake Mead. Engineers have built deeper intakes and low lake-level pumping infrastructure. Dam operators have adjusted releases and tested equipment. Upstream reservoirs have been coordinated to protect Powell. These actions have preserved service and purchased time. They are not illusions. They demonstrate that management changes outcomes. Yet successful intervention should not be confused with full recovery. A deeper intake prevents an older intake from becoming the final point of failure. It does not refill the reservoir. A conservation agreement can leave water in Mead for several years. It does not automatically reduce demand forever. An upstream release can protect Powell. It lowers storage somewhere else. A smaller release through Glen Canyon Dam can preserve hydraulic head. It sends less water toward Mead. Adaptation works by moving the threshold, reducing the load, or buying time. It does not repeal the water balance. That is the evidence line between resilience and reassurance. Resilience means the system can continue functioning under stress. Reassurance claims that the stress no longer matters. The first is supported. The second is not. There is another claim the evidence cannot support. It cannot tell us that history will repeat in exactly the same form. The years from 2021 through 2023 showed emergency reservoir releases, shortage declarations, declining hydropower capacity, and calls for major conservation. Then an unusually strong runoff season improved conditions and gave the reservoirs additional room. That sequence proves that emergency actions can hold the system long enough for favorable hydrology to arrive. It does not prove that another rescue season will arrive before the next threshold, nor does it prove that it will not. Forecasts are probabilities, not promises. The 24-month study is a planning tool built from current conditions and assumptions. Its most probable scenario is not a guaranteed future. Its probable minimum and probable maximum scenarios are not absolute boundaries. The river can surprise the model in either direction, but uncertainty is not a reason to ignore the forecast. It is the reason margin matters. When a system has abundant storage, a forecast error can be absorbed. When reservoir elevations approach infrastructure thresholds, the same error can remove the time required to respond. Operators are not acting because they know every future inflow. They are acting because waiting for certainty could leave only worse choices. That is why the 6 million acre-foot decision is important, even if the weather improves later. It reveals what federal managers believe must be protected now. It reveals that the earlier release plan carried too much risk for Powell under the updated hydrology. It reveals that water from Flaming Gorge is valuable enough to move downstream as emergency support. And it reveals that Mead is being asked to continue operating with less inflow from its largest upstream reservoir than previously planned. The event may be temporary. The vulnerability it exposes is structural. Two enormous reservoirs were built to provide storage, power, flood control, and stability across time. Their strength comes from their size. Their weakness comes from the fact that both depend on the same limited river. Powell cannot retain water and send that same water to Mead at the same moment. Mead cannot support every existing demand, while also preserving elevation indefinitely if inflow remains below outflow. Conservation cannot create snow, but it can reduce the speed at which stored water is consumed. Infrastructure cannot produce water, but it can preserve access at lower elevations. Forecasting cannot guarantee runoff, but it can provide enough warning to act before a threshold is crossed. Each tool solves one part of the problem, none solves all of it. This is why the future of the river will not be decided by a single dramatic day. It will be decided through repeated operating choices. How much water is released from Powell? How much is conserved at Mead? How much demand is permanently reduced? How much upstream storage is available for emergency support? How low the dams can operate safely? How quickly new rules respond when forecasts deteriorate? How fairly reductions are distributed among states, tribes, Mexico, cities, farms, industries, and ecosystems. The danger is not only that the system may run out of water, it is that the system may run out of acceptable choices while substantial water still remains. Return now to the federal dashboard where this story began. One line shows 6 million acre-feet, another shows weak inflow, another tracks Powell's elevation. Another projects the path of Mead. None of those lines alone describes a catastrophe. Together, they show the transfer. Snow that fails to become runoff leaves less water entering Powell. Less inflow pushes Powell toward critical operating elevations. Protecting those elevations requires holding back more water and moving storage from Flaming Gorge. The reduced release travels downstream as missing support for Mead. Lower Mead elevation reduces hydraulic head at Hoover Dam. Lower hydraulic head reduces generating capability. Less margin makes every future dry forecast, maintenance problem, demand spike, and negotiation more consequential. Then, the transfer reaches people through water rules, power costs, farm decisions, infrastructure budgets, and the reliability of systems expected to remain invisible. That is the full pathway. Not a sudden disappearance, but pressure moving from one component to the next. The river does not send a warning siren when its operating margin declines. It sends a spreadsheet. It sends a revised release schedule. It sends a pumping test, a lower power estimate, a conservation agreement, or a field that is not planted. By the time the signal becomes emotionally obvious, the technical system may have been carrying it for years. The event will pass. Water year 2026 will end. The release schedule will be replaced by another. Snow will return to the mountains. Some seasons will outperform forecasts. Others will disappoint. But the thing this event revealed will remain. A system designed around the assumption that large reservoirs could repeatedly restore stability is being tested by a river that may not provide enough recovery between shocks. The future will not be decided only by the lowest elevation or the largest annual release. It will be decided by whether the system can preserve time. Time for conservation to become permanent. Time for new operating rules to take effect. Time for infrastructure to be adapted before backup systems become overloaded. Time for tribal communities to receive the access and infrastructure long delayed. Time for farms and cities to change without forcing the greatest burden onto those with the fewest alternatives. Time for one reservoir to recover before protecting it places unbearable pressure on the next. The 6 million acre-foot release is therefore both an action and a question. The action protects Lake Powell from a more immediate threat. The question travels downstream with the water that is no longer coming on the old schedule. How many times can the system move scarcity from one reservoir, one power plant, one farm, one city, or one community to another before there is nowhere left with enough margin to receive it?